This is Bloomberg Law with June Grasso from Bloomberg Radio.
Workers at a Whole Foods market in Pennsylvania voted to unionize this week, the first win for labor at the Amazon-owned grocery store chain. Amazon has fiercely resisted union organizing efforts by its workers and is still waging a court battle against the first union election at a Staten Island warehouse 3 years ago, even challenging the structure of the National Labor Relations Board at a federal appeals court. Joining me is an expert in labor and employment law, Kate Andrias, a professor at Columbia Law School. Kate, tell us about this first union win at Whole Foods.
At least within the United States, it's the first to organize. And Amazon has been a notoriously anti-union company. It's fought the union, as you know, very aggressively in its warehouses, where one group of workers has successfully organized. But these workers at Whole Foods also work for Amazon or in the Amazon overall corporate family, and they decided to organize the union. They withstood a very intense anti-union campaign by the employer, but a majority of them continued, stuck together, and did vote in an NLRB election to unionize.
It was close, 130 workers to 100. Tell us about this campaign of intimidation, and the union local also filed unfair labor practice charges against Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of close vote count is not at all uncommon due to anti-union campaigns that employers run. So frequently when workers file for an election, they have a very strong majority. And then what happens is that employers engage in a lot of anti-union campaigning, some of which is illegal, some of which is legal, but that is aimed to coerce workers into not exercising their right to unionize, ranging from things like holding mandatory meetings where they tell workers not to vote for the union, or they suggest that if they do, they're going to lose benefits. Sometimes they threaten individual workers or even fire individual workers. And all of those activities are designed to try to convince workers not to organize unions. The allegation is that Whole Foods did commit various unfair labor practices during this campaign, but those would have to be adjudicated by the board.
The company has 5 days to challenge the election before the results are certified, and then it has to bargain with the union for a contract covering the store's unionized workers. But nearly 3 years ago, and we talked about this, Amazon warehouse workers in Staten Island voted to be represented by a union. Now they've since affiliated with the Teamsters. But Amazon has refused to come to the bargaining table in 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, so the problem is that the law obligates employers to bargain in good faith, but it doesn't have a lot of enforcement mechanism. For example, it doesn't have a mechanism for the government, for the NLRB to impose a settlement if the employer refuses to bargain in good faith. So employers frequently exploit the weaknesses in the law to resist bargaining, especially for a first contract. So, for example, they can file challenges and objections, even frivolous objections, just to delay. But even if they just agree to bargain, often they engage in surface bargaining, so just going through the motions of bargaining. And again, doing so is illegal. It's an unfair labor practice, but the remedies essentially are insufficient. Usually what happens is the board orders them to bargain. So it really does highlight why we need labor law reform in this country. That said, that doesn't mean workers never win first contracts. And when they're sufficiently united and when they successfully organize other stores within the chain, that often creates enough economic pressure on the company to bargain. And so what we've seen happen, for example, in Starbucks, they also haven't reached a first contract, but they've made a lot more progress, and the company does appear to be bargaining because so many Starbucks shops across the country have organized. So the more workers organize, the more power they have within a particular firm, the more likely it is they are able to win a first contract, even if the employer violates the law. The other complication facing workers today, as weak as the law is, the Biden board was very aggressive in trying to enforce the law, in going to court where necessary to get injunctions, and issuing decisions against employers who violate the law. And the future of the board is very much in question right now under the Trump administration.
The Amazon workers in Staten Island are affiliated now with the Teamsters, a really powerful union. If the Teamsters can't get Amazon to the bargaining table, then I wonder what can.
Well, I think that the workers now have a lot more resources behind them because they have affiliated with the Teamsters. I also think that the Teamsters are working with other Amazon workers across the country to try to organize at other facilities, and that really can help build enough power to force Amazon into bargaining. So I think that really has to be a long-term strategy of organizing more workers within the company. I know that many workers are interested, or that's what I understand, at least that many workers within the company are interested. And so I think long-term, if more warehouses organize, then that can create enough pressure on the company to bargain in good faith.
Coming up next on the Bloomberg Law Show, I'll continue this conversation with Columbia Law School professor Kate Andrias. Amazon has challenged the election outcome in court. They accuse the NLRB of tampering in the union election. And Amazon, along with Elon Musk's SpaceX, is challenging the constitutionality of the National Labor Relations Board at the Fifth Circuit, which is the most conservative circuit in the country. Tell us about their arguments at the Fifth Circuit about the constitutionality of the NLRB.
So Amazon is making a number of arguments about why the board is unconstitutional, including arguing that the structure of the NLRB is unconstitutional. And this is part of a number of cases that various employers have brought challenging the constitutionality of the board. Among other arguments, they contend that the fact that the president cannot fire board members or fire administrative law judges whenever he wants, that is unconstitutional. And they also argue that the structure of the board, because the board exercises various powers that are not purely executive in nature, that violates principles of separation of powers. And it means that Congress has delegated too much power to the executive branch. So they're making some fairly fundamental arguments challenging the structure of the board, which would also draw into question many other administrative agencies. And these are arguments that the Supreme Court rejected nearly 100 years ago. First, in a case involving the Federal Trade Commission, the court held that it is permissible for Congress to put restrictions on when the president can fire board members when there's a multi-member board. So it is permissible for Congress to design an agency so that it has some measure of independence from the president to create multi-member boards where the board members serve for terms and can only be removed for cause. The Supreme Court has already affirmed that in a case called Humphrey's Executor way back in 1935. And then in 1937, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the NLRA. So the companies, including Amazon, are challenging these nearly 100 years of precedent that holds that the board is constitutional and that the NLRA is constitutional. So they're really trying to upend our system of labor law that's been around for 100 years and also attack the whole administrative state in doing so.
So that brings me to the question that I've been asking a lot lately. Those decisions were well before the Roberts Court began to curb agency powers. So might this court look at the issue differently?
Yeah, I think there's a real risk. So as you said, the Roberts Court has issued a series of opinions that weakens administrative agencies. And these cases, which Amazon is pursuing, but also which President Trump is teeing up because he just fired one of the board members, these cases tee up for the Supreme Court a question about whether or not it should overrule this very long-standing precedent. And there certainly is some reason to fear that this court that has been so hostile to administrative agencies and also so hostile to workers in various labor cases might find merit in these really unprecedented legal arguments.
Let's talk for a minute about that. He removed a Democratic member of the NLRB. Also, he removed 2 Democratic EEOC commissioners. Those actions are unprecedented, but as far as the NLRB goes, is it unlawful?
I believe it is unlawful under the existing law because the statute allows the president to fire board members upon notice and hearing for neglect of duty or malfeasance in office, but for no other cause. And as far as I know, there's been no allegation that the board member who was removed engaged in any neglect of duty or malfeasance in office. So it is on its face an action that is illegal, that contradicts the statute.
Kate, does the same thing apply to the firings of the EEOC commissioners, or is that a different law?
So it's a different statute, but it also has for-cause protection. So those commissioners also can only be removed for cause. And my understanding, again, is that there's no allegation that they did anything that would merit termination for cause.
I assume that the commissioners are going to file lawsuits over these firings, and anyone Trump appoints to fill those slots would be in a tenuous position. How long can litigation like this take?
Well, in the ordinary case, it could take quite a while for a case to go all the way up through the court system. There's also the possibility that the parties would seek expedited relief. So it's a little hard to predict how long it will take. Similar issues, though, are also percolating in those other cases that we discussed where the employers have made the argument that these removal protections, the statutory provisions that prevent the president from firing board members, are illegal. So the case could get up to the Supreme Court either through a challenge made by the EEOC commissioners or Commissioner Wilcox on the board, or through one of these other cases that's currently in the Fifth Circuit.
Do the Supreme Court's decisions having to do with appointments and protections for removal have any bearing here?
There are a few cases from the court in recent years that have drawn into question removal protections of other kinds of officers within administrative agencies. So there was a case in which the court held that protections against removal for a single head agency, that those are unconstitutional. And there was another case where the court held that dual for-cause protection, so that there's essentially two layers of protection, that is impermissible. But the court hasn't extended those rulings to either these multi-member boards, where the decision was reached in 1935 that is okay to protect them from firing, nor has it extended the idea that the president has the right to fire whomever he wants, whenever he wants, to administrative law judges. And there's good policy reasons for not allowing the president to fire administrative law judges or members of these independent agencies, board members or commissioners. So with the judges, in order to have a system of rule of law, we want judges to have a measure of independence, to be doing their work based on merit and not out of fear that if they issue a decision with which the president disagrees, that they'll lose their job. It's the same basic idea for why we have life tenure for federal judges. We want a system of independent judging to uphold the rule of law, and that's why Congress designed the system in that way. The same thing with these multi-member agencies. Congress designed them in order that they would have a certain measure of independence from the president. Now, they still ultimately largely follow the president's policy views, because when the president wins, he or she ends up appointing the majority of the members. So we do see the board's policies switching quite a bit when there's a change in administration, but they don't have to be worried about losing their jobs, unless they violate the law or in some other way deserve to be fired for cause.
So, we're going from a President Biden who walked the picket lines in Detroit to a president that is opposed to unions. Besides, what you've talked about, are there any other implications of having a president like this in the White House?
Yeah, the president has made really clear that he's opposed to unions. He's opposed to workers having a right to strike. He's opposed to workers unionizing. What we saw during the last Trump administration was that he picked officials to lead agencies who took a very anti-worker position on a range of issues, from overtime pay to right to organize to who counts as an employee and therefore gets rights under the statute. A whole host of issues. Trump has, in the past at least, picked officials to lead the agency who've taken a very anti-worker position. My guess is we're likely to see that happen again. In addition, I think we also will see a lot of anti-worker activity from this administration with respect to the federal workforce, as we already have.
We certainly have seen a lot of that, and several lawsuits filed already. Thanks so much, Kate. That's Professor Kate Andrias of Columbia Law School. Eric Adams is the first New York City mayor in modern history to be indicted while in office, facing federal charges of bribery, fraud, conspiracy, and soliciting illegal campaign contributions. Adams has pleaded not guilty and refused to step down. He's also been making overtures to President Donald Trump. attending his inauguration, and even traveling to Mar-a-Lago in Florida just before the inauguration to meet with the president-elect. Adams has said his legal case was never discussed.
He wanted a small conversation as he is getting ready to move into the presidency. I enjoyed the conversation. We talked about the issue of the city of New York.
Now, as first reported by the New York Times, Justice Department officials have discussed dropping the corruption charges against Adams with prosecutors in the Southern District of New York who are handling the case. Joining me is Dave Aronberg, former Palm Beach County state attorney. Eric Adams is scheduled to go to trial in April. Do these Justice Department discussions about dropping the case against him at this point strike you as unusual, fishy, or par for the course?
Well, June, we've always known that Donald Trump was transactional, and he likes people who like him. And Eric Adams went to Mar-a-Lago at the last minute when he got the invitation, and he also went to the inauguration at the last minute when he got the invitation. He went down there to pay homage, to pay tribute to the leader, the guy who could pardon him, and it looks like it's paying dividends. Eric Adams is saying that those visits were to represent the people of New York, but they weren't on his official calendar, and he didn't want too many people to know what he was doing and what he was talking about. So we know what was going on here. Eric Adams is there to save himself. He knows he's not going to get reelected as mayor, and so he wants to preserve his freedom, and it looks like it may be working.
Eric Adams' lawyer is Alex Spiro, the personal attorney for Elon Musk. Does that connection to Trump's new best friend help?
Well, when it comes to Alex Spiro, he has had a lot of high-profile clients. He's currently representing Jay-Z, for example. He successfully got Alec Baldwin out of his mess. He's a bulldog. He is a very aggressive attorney, someone who's not very well liked because he is known for being extremely arrogant. So he fits right in with this crowd, apparently. I don't know how much influence he has in MAGA world, but I'm sure he helps with Elon, which helps with Trump, but ultimately it's Trump's decision, and Trump likes people who like him, and Eric Adams has gone overboard to genuflect at the Trump altar. This is so obvious. I mean, we all know that Eric Adams is a whole lot of legal trouble that Trump can get him out of. Only Trump can save him, really. Now, what is interesting is that when he took off to the inauguration, he left a couple Martin Luther King Day events that he had committed to, and he just took off. He seems to know that his political days in New York are numbered, and so now it's all about protecting your freedom.
New York is a sanctuary city, and there was a high-profile ICE raid, pre-dawn raid in the Bronx on Tuesday, which the new Secretary of Homeland Security went on. And Adams said later that he directed the NYPD to coordinate with DHS Homeland Security investigations and other federal law enforcement agencies, as allowed by law, to conduct a targeted operation. Quite a different reaction than from the mayor of Chicago, which is also a sanctuary city.
Well, yeah. I mean, and the mayor is interested in staying out of the hoosegow. And so I'm not surprised he hasn't raised a fuss about Trump's executive actions. So this is the administration we're going to be dealing with. This is an administration that is transactional, and Eric Adams is facing years in prison. Look at Bob Menendez. Bob Menendez and Eric Adams essentially did the same thing, allegedly, where Eric Adams was involved with Turkey, Bob Menendez was involved with Egypt, and they were all taking foreign funds illegally, allegedly for Eric Adams. And when it comes to the two of them, look how different. Meanwhile, Eric Adams may get a pardon and may even avoid a trial, and Bob Menendez was sentenced to 11 years in prison. It just depends, I guess, on whether or not the president of the United States likes you. And Bob Menendez now is speaking out and saying things that are sympathetic towards Donald Trump. I wonder why. You know, Bob Menendez came out and said that he understands Donald Trump's feelings about federal law enforcement and the weaponization. And, you know, so now he's starting to play for the party. I mean, get in line. Michael Avenatti, you've got all these people who used to be Trump critics now lining up to say nice things about the guy who can secure their freedom.
And to add to the list of people seeking pardons, Sam Bankman-Fried. According to Bloomberg sources, his parents are exploring ways to secure a pardon. They've had meetings in recent weeks with lawyers and other figures considered to be in Trump's orbit about clemency for SBF, who's serving a 25-year sentence. Trump has set the precedent, as you mentioned. For Adams, let's talk about getting a pardon versus having the Justice Department drop the charges. It looks better for both Trump and Eric Adams if the case is dropped rather than that he's convicted and given a pardon.
Oh, yeah. Also, it avoids a lot of expense, time, aggravation if you can just get rid of it now. But no matter what happens, Eric Adams' political career is toast. It just whether or not he can stay out of prison and avoid a trial. So, I don't blame him for trying to play for that. That's his best route to get out of these charges. More charges could be coming. Of course, he could always face state charges, which are pardon-proof. So that's another possibility if he is pardoned before any trial. See, once a jury is seated, then double jeopardy attaches. And so there is a pitfall. There is a risk in having a pardon that comes too soon, because then it could still open him up to state charges.
What's also sort of unusual and perhaps problematic for the Southern District is that the interim U.S. attorney last week issued this rebuke to Adams' claims that he's the victim of political persecution. And also, earlier this month, prosecutors wrote that they'd continued to uncover additional criminal conduct by Adams, indicating that there might be new charges in the works. And the defense attorney also mentioned additional evidence. So it's a peculiar time to be dropping the case, and it's a bad look for the Southern District.
Well, the bad look would be for the White House if they bigfooted the Southern District and said, we're ending this whole case. And it would be because of politics purely. But we saw 1,500 rioters get pardoned. Some of them are violent cop attackers. So why should we be surprised that Trump looks like he is going to pardon the mayor of New York City who is playing nice to him?
I wonder what the future of public corruption cases is in the Trump administration, because earlier this week, the Justice Department senior career official in charge of overseeing public corruption investigations resigned after the Trump administration reassigned him to a new role working on immigration issues. And federal prosecutors have moved to stop several ongoing cases, including one against Jeffrey Fortenberry, a Republican congressman from Nebraska who was facing a second trial on campaign finance violations.
June, we're going to see this a lot where people who are independent of Trump, who could go a different direction than the White House, will be reassigned, removed, fired. There'll be a lot of that going on. I'm hopeful that when Pam Bondi is confirmed as Attorney General, he'll steady the ship, because right now the ship at the Department of Justice is sinking. The one thing you can say is that none of this is a surprise. Trump ran on politicizing the Department of Justice. He was going to make sure they're not independent. He ran as being your retribution. And so we should not be surprised by it. It's gotten real lately, because you see actual things happening, like the release of violent rioters, the ending of corruption cases. It just depends on which side you're on. Are you on Trump's side or are you on the other side? Because if you're on the other side against Trump, then those cases aren't going away.
Of course, they also fired at least a dozen prosecutors who worked on Trump's criminal cases. Quote, in light of their actions, the acting attorney general does not trust these officials to assist in faithfully implementing the president's agenda. This action is consistent with the mission of ending the weaponization of government. Can those prosecutors now sue the Trump administration?
They do have recourse because they are not political appointees. They have civil service protections. But even though they can win in court and get their jobs back, really, what future do they have at this Department of Justice? Even if they get their jobs back, they'll get reassigned to some area where they don't want to be. They'll get sent to the basement to count paper clips. So no matter what happens, their days at the Department of Justice under this administration are numbered. As far as winning in court, yeah, they could win in court and get some back pay and have the court chastise the Trump administration, but Trump doesn't care.
Stay with me, Dave. Coming up next, As President Trump is reshaping the Justice Department, his pick to lead the FBI, Kash Patel, faced opposition from Senate Democrats during his confirmation hearings today, with critics accusing him of lacking experience and judgment to lead the agency. Patel insisted that he didn't have an enemies list and that the Bureau under his leadership would not seek retribution against Trump's adversaries or launch investigations for political purposes.
The only thing that will matter if I'm confirmed as the director of the FBI is a de-weaponized, depoliticized system of law enforcement completely devoted to rigorous obedience of the Constitution and a singular standard of justice.
Patel faced a persistent line of attack from Democrats. They confronted Patel with a vast catalog of his incendiary statements, including an enemies list in the 2023 book he authored and his calls for purging anti-Trump conspirators in the government and news media. Here's an exchange he had with Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island.
Here's what this nominee himself has said about using his office to prosecute journalists. We will go out and find the conspirators, not just in government, but in the media. We're going to come after you, whether it's criminally or civilly. Is that a correct quotation, Mr. Patel?
Senator, that's a partial quotation.
But it's correct.
In part.
I've been talking to former Palm Beach County State Attorney Dave Aronberg. So Trump has picked to lead the FBI, a man who said on a podcast after the election that he would turn the FBI building into a museum.
He's been a critic of the FBI, calling it the deep state. I've known Kash Patel for a while and haven't spoken to him or seen him since 2017, but he was, I would say, previously on Team Normal until he changed around 2020, I think it was, when the CIA flagged his national security file and referred him to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation over allegedly mishandling classified information. And this is while Patel was high up in the Trump National Security Agency. And so Patel reacted to that, and that would be, according to Patel's critics, his villain origination story, because that's when he hardened his views against the so-called deep state, because he had to deal with that criminal investigation of him, and he said he did nothing wrong. This was a material that he included in a memo that he circulated involving the Russia probe. So, he's always been out to get those who investigated Trump over Russia, and now he saw the CIA moving against him. So he was out to get them after that. And then later on in 2022, he learned that the Department of Justice had subpoenaed his Gmail account, his personal emails, back in 2017 while he was working for the House Select Intelligence Committee as senior counsel. And they were investigating a potential leak that happened, a leak of national security information. So Patel did not realize that his emails had been subpoenaed and given over to the Department of Justice. So that just steeled his resolve to go after the so-called deep state. That's what led to his enemies list, 60 individuals from the deep state who he wants to incarcerate, including members of what he calls the media mafia. So that's why Kash Patel became who he is today. He's a different person than when I knew him a few years ago.
So what is his goal for the FBI then?
He has said that he wants to get the FBI back to being cops, where they're not involved with the intelligence community. But remember, the reason why the FBI is involved with intelligence and works so closely with the CIA was because of 9/11. There was so much criticism that the FBI was asleep at the wheel, that bin Laden was doing all these nefarious things and the FBI was not coordinating with the CIA. And that's why there were reforms in place. So it looks like Patel wants to undo that and go back to the original mission of the FBI, domestic law enforcement. But that will come at the expense, in my mind, of national security.
Up to 6 top FBI executives have been told to expect reassignments if Kash Patel is confirmed as director. And they're the officials handling active terrorists, cyber, and other threats. And these are people who are experienced in their field and well-respected.
Right, because he wants to limit the scope of the FBI. His personal experience was that the FBI encroached upon his personal liberties. And he, like Trump, interprets actions against themselves as actions against the United States. So Trump says, I will be a retribution, and Kash Patel has the same enemies list as Donald Trump. So it's a match made in heaven, right? Well, because both of them are on the same page when it comes to going after the same enemies. Now, I do think that once Kash Patel is in the role of FBI director, I do think he will back off a bit on just targeting enemies, because Pam Bondi already said that's not going to happen here, and he can only go so far. He can get himself in a lot of trouble if he fakes evidence and brings garbage cases against individuals. He'll blow up in his face. Now, but he can do damage if he does go after individuals he dislikes. As they say, you can beat the rat, but you can't beat the ride.
Let's say he's successful at what he wants to do to the FBI and he remains in office for 4 years. How much damage can he do?
Well, if he changes the scope of the FBI to no longer work with the CIA on intelligence, international terrorism, and counterintelligence, then I think our national security will be at risk. That's what led to 9/11. So you may not see the impact until much later. But at some point, if, God forbid, there's a terrorist attack in this country and you wonder why the FBI was not coordinating with our spy agencies, well, there's a reason why.
Well, we shall see if a fierce critic of the FBI gets to lead it. Thanks so much, Dave. That's Dave Aronberg, former Palm Beach County State Attorney. Former U.S. Senator Bob Menendez was sentenced to 11 years in prison for acting as a foreign agent of Egypt and accepting gold bars and other bribes in what prosecutors said was perhaps the worst corruption case ever involving a U.S. senator. Menendez maintains his innocence.
Welcome to the Southern District of New York, the Wild West of political prosecutions. President Trump is right. This process is political, and it's corrupted to the core.
Joining me is Bloomberg legal reporter David Voreacos, who covered the trial and the sentencing. David, 11 years for a 71-year-old man seems like a harsh punishment.
It is a very tough sentence that U.S. District Judge Sidney Stein gave to ex-Senator Menendez, but it's actually a departure downward from advisory sentencing guidelines under federal law. The judge gave him a bit of leniency for his age and for his 5 decades of service to the public as an elected official.
Tell us about his tearful plea to the judge before he was sentenced.
Bob Menendez was quite choked up. The courtroom was packed, and he made a heartfelt, emotional appeal for mercy. He asked the judge to consider his long career in the Senate and the House and the many actions he had taken for his constituents, the legislative accomplishments that he had achieved, and the advocacy that he had put forward on behalf of Hispanics, people in New Jersey, Cuban refugees or immigrants in the United States. He sort of gave a tearful overview of his career and said that the judge should not focus only on his crimes, but, the full accomplishments in his life.
When he went outside the courtroom, he seemed to be reaching out to President Trump. He said, the process is political and it's corrupted to the core. I hope President Trump cleans up the cesspool and restores integrity to the system. Is he looking for a pardon from Trump?
He is planning to ask Trump for a pardon. It's not clear whether that would happen. He has been a vocal critic of Trump for many years, but in saying that he's the victim of a witch hunt now, which is what he said yesterday, he's sort of parroting the language that Trump uses, and he seems to be appealing to Trump's sense that the Justice Department is broken and carries out vindictive and political prosecutions.
He says he's going to appeal. Do you know any of the arguments he plans to raise in the appeal?
Yeah, a couple of the arguments have to do with the speech or debate protections that legislators have through the U.S. Constitution. There was a dispute that happened in the last couple of months relating to the laptop full of exhibits that went to jurors. And prosecutors disclosed that they gave exhibits that were unredacted and supposed to be redacted to the jury that the defense lawyers said directly implicated the speech or debate clause by referring to legislative actions that Menendez took.
Quite a downfall for a once powerful and respected senator. Thanks so much, David. That's David Voreacos, Bloomberg legal reporter. And that's it for this edition of the Bloomberg Law Show. Remember, you can always get the latest legal news on our Bloomberg Law podcast. You can find them on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and at www.bloomberg.com/podcast/law. And remember to tune into the Bloomberg Law Show every weeknight at 10 p.m. Wall Street time. I'm June Grasso, and you're listening to Bloomberg.